Is now the right time to launch a new business or product? Timing is a big influence on the success of many companies and their products. Today, I'm interviewing the author of the book, Why Now? And we're going to talk about market timing, which is critical to the success of many companies. To survive and thrive, you must adopt a product-driven mindset. And we're back for another episode of Product Driven. Today I'm joined by Paul Orlando, a previous founder, advisors, worked with a lot of different startups over the last couple decades. He's currently a professor, teaching all these great things. Wrote a book called Why Now? We're going to talk to him today about his book and about how product timing, market timing, making decisions about when you build different features in your product, launching a company, all these things. Timing is really important. I know timing for my startups has been really important. I'm sure we may talk about that today. So Paul, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Matt. This is the kind of podcast I wish I had when I was a founder.
Well, I love talking about product stuff, and I've interviewed now like a thousand people, a lot of founders on the podcast, and it's incredible the different stories that you hear. But one of the recurring themes is about what you wrote your book about, which is timing. Right. And I'm sure we both probably have a lot of stories about that. But what led you to write this book? Like, what motivated you to get up every day and write this book?
It was a few things. So first off, I like to write. And so I wouldn't necessarily push writing a book on just anybody. But if you enjoy it, it's a great way to clarify your thoughts. And for me, the topic, like this timing topic, the why now topic, it's something that, if you're in the startup world, you'll hear this again and again. Like, why now? Why is this the right time for this product to exist? And I used to hear this question come up, and people would say, wow, it's really important. But yet I never really saw anybody dive deeply into this topic. And so this is what I, am trying to do in this book. When I reflect on my own startup experience, so the first, I guess I'll call it like the first true startup that I had, 12 or so years ago, was really like a too early version of, if you remember, Clubhouse. And maybe Clubhouse also isn't a great success story, but if you remember Clubhouse from the early part of the pandemic, and raised, I forget, over 100 million, this audio social network. We had something that was kind of like that, but, if you can imagine it, in a world that was, instead of, 5G, it was more like, a 2G world. And so just a lot of the technical problems that we dealt with, those were gone by the time Clubhouse rolled around like 10 years later. And so I kind of reflected on my experience. As I started to do research on this, I went and I looked at some of the .com era, like the big names that came out of that time, 25 years ago or so, that raised what was a lot of money back then, and then basically, flamed out, failed. And then I saw, a lot of those startups from the 90s that didn't work out, they were replaced by startups from the early 2000s that were, in many ways pretty similar to them, but those did work out. And so it was a combination of all those things, like my personal experience doing some of this early research, and I just kept diving deeply into this, this timing topic.
Well, and some companies are definitely successful because they're riding a bigger wave, right? Like the obvious one right now is AI. But if you look back in history, 25 years ago when I started building software, it really wasn't web-based. It wasn't browser-based, right? It was desktop, point-click client server kind of software, right? So, and then a lot of web apps came out in the early 2000s that started to replace the older desktop stuff, right? And then towards the end of the 2000s, we started getting more and more mobile. And all of a sudden, like mobile was its own wave, right? Like, and now everything is cloud, and things have moved to the cloud, and integrations and all these things that have changed software. But some of it, like from your example, it's like you're just riding those different waves. Like you could have had the best software in the world that was like this client server, like think about like old version of QuickBooks or something, right? And then it's like they didn't keep up with it. If they didn't keep up with the times, now everybody wants a web-based version. You're like, well, I'm not going to use QuickBooks anymore. I'm going to something else. Because it's easier to use and it's mobile and this and the old company didn't keep up.
Right. Yeah. So many examples of that. But also for something like a QuickBooks, they've got customer lock-in. So like
Yeah,
I will
they
as
can move
as
slower.
they can move slower. They can almost rely on their customers. You know, in general, people don't like to learn new things. So
Yeah,
like, okay, I'm just used to this, you know, generation out of date, software, but I'm going to stick with it. Or it's like a policy decision. Like the decision is made by somebody, not me. I've got to use QuickBooks, and so they stick with it for that reason. It's like one of the interesting things in the timing question. So we often hear about first mover advantage, and the funny thing, so I didn't know this until I started doing this research and writing, but the originators of that term were two professors in the 1980s. And they wrote this paper about first mover advantages. And if you think back to the dot-com era, that term was used by a lot of dot-com startups to raise money. Hey, we are the first mover in,
yeah,
whatever, right? And the funny thing is, when I went and I like read the research, from those two authors, um, they weren't really saying that. They weren't saying like, yes, be the first mover and you will win. They were saying, here's a bunch of scenarios where there are advantages to be the first mover, but most of the time you are not at an advantage at all. And like the summary, like the two advantages or two situations where there's an advantage for the first mover is first, if you can lock in your customers, kind of like that QuickBooks example, like people just get used to using you, they don't want to switch. And then the second is if you can exclude those future competitors from getting access to the same resources. So that might be like an IP kind of situation, or maybe you're actually like controlling access to like a data source, or maybe even like talent. Like if there's limited talent that can actually build this specific thing. Um, so most of the time, we're not in a world like that, and it's not the first mover who wins. And that was the interesting thing. And you know, all my work in this why now topic, um, you can think of any like popular product or company today, and you can find like an earlier version of it.
yeah,
Sometimes like
that didn't survive.
decades, like decades and decades earlier.
Yeah,
Um, so like the one of the examples that I bring out in the book, and so early in my career, I worked at AT&T, and T, and I was doing voice over IP stuff when it was like this was a little before Skype actually. So the end user never knew about it, but we were routing the calls over like a private like IP line, and it was to get around this regulatory regime. And you can have a cheaper, cheaper, telephone calls. Now we don't even think about that type of thing. But I worked at AT&T, and T, and I had never heard this story, but I found this in my research. So in the 1960s, AT&T had actually developed and commercialized video phones. So like
okay,
this
wow.
call that we're doing now with live video, uh, they had this set top like desktop box with a camera, microphone, and a little screen, black and white, and you could actually have this video call. Now, it was incredibly expensive. Um, if I remember right, when you adjust it for inflation, it's like well into the thousands of dollars for the device.
Okay.
And also, I want to say like around I'm gonna get this wrong, but like approximately like $1,000 a month for the subscription, like to make the calls. Um, and then they also, of course, had this problem of because it's so expensive and very few people have these. Well, there's no use if like I have it and you don't. I can't call you. So it was a complete flop. But the fascinating thing for me was I had no idea that in the 60s you could actually make this technology work. Now, the business model didn't work at all. And like they folded, the product. And it wasn't really until everybody had like, I guess, a webcam, that they would put on the top of their, desktop computer, and like, broadband, into the home, when we started to see the popularization of, video calling, and certainly when people got smartphones with cameras. But it's just interesting. Like, it's almost like any product idea that you see that's popular now, like you can find like an earlier and earlier version of it, sometimes so early that it's just like mind-boggling.
Well, my first company, Vin Solutions, reminds me a lot of this story because we started in 2003, and it started with how do we take pictures of cars and upload the pictures and the details about the cars to the internet, to autotrader.com and eBay and cars.com and all this stuff. And back then, digital cameras were extremely expensive, and the quality of the cameras was terrible,
Yeah.
right? And I actually built a mobile app in 2004, 2005. This was before the iPhone existed. I built a mobile app that was like on an old compact, little Palm Pilots. Like, it was on a
Yeah.
Palm Pilot, right? And it ran Windows CE, like, and these things didn't even have a camera in it. It had a camera that you could put in it with an SD card, and it had like a 1 megapixel camera.
Right.
And we were way ahead of the time. The picture quality was terrible, but our customers loved it because it was so easy to use to take pictures of the cars. But they're like, if it was sunny outside, you couldn't use it. There'd be too much glare. Like, there was
Yeah.
all of these problems, right? And first mover advantage, right? But the technology wasn't ready. Like, we were
Yeah.
way ahead of the times. And then eventually we Ricoh created a camera that you could type like a stock number into, like 2 or 3 years later, and we moved to that. But now you could make a mobile app and use an iPhone or Android or whatever and take great pictures, right?
Right.
And part of it is, I feel like some of these things drive awareness and do drive some market validation, right? You're like, okay, they didn't quite have the right thing, but they had the right idea. And then how do we iterate on that idea? And ultimately, they're creating some awareness and demand in the market, and then other people may see that and like, oh, look what they're doing over there. I can do a better job of it, right? And so, to your point earlier, sometimes it's the second or third mover that comes along that might be able to execute better, has a better go-to-market strategy, as part of a bigger company that can deliver the product or whatever, and they're able to use those advantages to squash whoever was the first mover.
It's so true. And so, like, one of the frameworks that I show in the book is, so first off, you, as the founder, you are observing what's going on in the world, and you notice some things. And the first thing I ask you to look for are what I call timing drivers. So I list 12 of these in the book. I'm not going to go list all 12 right now, but these might be a new technology that's coming online. It's maybe a regulatory change. Maybe it's a crisis of some sort. And they all behave in little different ways, but you're noticing something and you spot, hey, there's this new opportunity that's coming up. But then the crucial thing that you should do next is to reflect on, okay, how is that change going to impact my business model?
COVID was the
So,
best example of this,
yes. Yeah.
right? Like, my
Yep.
company, we're sitting there, we're trying to figure out, are we going to be a winner or a loser because of this,
Yep.
right?
And
How is this going
that's
to affect us?
and that's I mean, COVID is like an amazing example because it was so sudden and so extreme. And so if you could build fast, you know, you could do really well. Like, I had a friend who, um, I didn't see. Well, I mean, it was COVID, I guess. I didn't see him for a while, and then, like last year, he got back in touch with me and said, like, oh, like, yeah, during COVID, I built this huge like testing, like, business, and then sold it, and like, did really well. Now, to be able to do that, you don't know how long that, like, lockdown and, testing kind of requirement, world is going to last. So if you can act fast, yeah, you could do really well. And that's a situation like that crisis kind of driver that
Yeah.
you did not have an opportunity to do stuff like that, previously. Like, the business, like, you could have done it, but like the business model didn't support that.
But
People were not looking for that type of, thing.
the people
Yep.
that are the most successful, I believe, when these things happen are the ones that are prepared for it, right?
Yep.
It's people that were trying to do online education before COVID
Sure. Yeah.
happened, and all of a sudden the demand went through through the roof, just
Yeah.
like Zoom and some of these
Zoom.
other
Yeah.
people
Yep.
just blew up overnight. But they didn't start like that
Hmm.
day. They had been doing this for potentially years ahead. It's the same thing with AI, right? You have people
Hmm.
like Jasper and some of these other. They were playing with AI. They were trying to make it work. It sort of halfway worked. It wasn't super great. But then ChatGPT and all this stuff came out, and they were able to quickly adapt and ride the wave because they had already kind of laid the foundation, right? Like they'd already put so much work into this. They were able to
Yeah.
capitalize on the movement when it happened. And that's what happened with my first company, Bin Solutions. Like we had built the perfect software for online like CRM for handling internet leads for car dealers. And when the recession happened, all the car dealers went to online. They stopped advertising on radio and TV and newspapers, and like
Hmm.
the newspapers died, all that stuff. So all the
Right.
money went online, and we were in the right place at the right time. But we had been there for the previous 4 or 5 years, like building, like we had the product, right? So,
Yeah.
but some people can react very quickly, right? They have to move quickly to jump on the wave. But the big winners are going to be the ones that were already ready for it.
Yeah. I don't disagree. And so like a lot of those, yeah, a lot of those overnight successes, I mean, I had used Zoom before the pandemic, but probably just a couple times, and then all of a sudden, like I'm using it every day.
Yeah.
Um, but
Now I don't use it at all.
yeah, well, hey, nobody wants to go back to the like sitting in front of their a screen all day long. Um, but yeah, so like there's situations like that where and I guess like the third piece of that framework. So first, it's looking for those timing drivers. Next, understanding how your business model improves. That last piece is really reflecting on, okay, your organization. Are you one that can say move really fast and you're actually going to be better off being an early entrant here? Or instead, are you better off hanging back, letting somebody else go first, and then trying to enter later on and maybe overtake them? And it's really a reflection on, so it could be, hey, we were already in this space, we have that expertise. Or we might have like just a deep, like, deep engineering talent and we could build quickly. Or on the flip side, it might be, okay, we don't have those two things, but we are great at marketing and understanding how to like productize something. So we could see what these earlier entrants are doing, and then we're going to go and overtake them. Um, so there's all ways that you can kind of reflect on what's a fit for your organization and in a certain situation. But yeah, like I think of the overall timing topic as as with anything that's kind of strategic, it's not like there's a single answer that fits every single situation or individual. You kind of have to understand what your capabilities are and also where you want to be, and then I try to provide some ways to to think through that, and some very actionable things you could do.
Well, most entrepreneurs start a business because they have a need, they have a problem to solve. They look around the market, they can't find somebody to solve it, and then they're just crazy enough to be like, okay, fine, I'm going to try and do this myself. If I need this thing, I can probably find other people that need this thing, right? But sometimes that means that really nobody needs this thing.
Hmm.
Right? And actually,
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody at a lunch day about this, that we were joking. I'm like, does this mean it's a terrible idea? Like, there's no market demand for this thing, right? But that's the struggle as an entrepreneur. You don't really know. You have to kind of go on your gut feeling a little bit of like, is now the time to build this thing? Have I come up with an idea that there's other people that would buy this, or have I come up with an idea that nobody cares about, or everybody thinks it's a bad idea?
Yeah. Um, that's why it's always good to be talking to customers, but you can't necessarily trust what they're telling you. You also have to you also have to think like, well, I as that founder can make this new thing and change the world in this one way, and giving people building for that opportunity. I if I'm right, I can help people understand, oh, okay, if I use this new thing, my life actually becomes better in this way, and then
So
I
in your
adopt
book,
it.
did you have any kind of frameworks to help people kind of think through this process?
Yeah. A number. So first, that framework that I kind of presented, earlier, looking for the timing drivers, business
Hmm.
model change, and then the organizational impact. Some of the other, frameworks that I included. So one set of them is what I call timing patterns, and so this is how we can look back at you know case studies of previous companies that maybe are different from us, but they were reacting to a similar set of timing drivers. So, like for example, one of the timing patterns that I wrote about is one that I call the hermit crab. And so this is a combination when you see there's a tech driver, there's a crisis, and there's an economic driver as well. And so if you think back to say the dot-com bubble bursting in the early 2000s, we had all this excess bandwidth that was built by companies like Global Crossing, WorldCom, like these companies that were really like the high flyers,
A lot of dark fiber.
dark fiber that's there. And then a few years later, you get like video streaming companies like primarily like YouTube is like one of the big winners coming out of that time. But what used to be expensive now is very cheap. Like,
Yeah.
oh, we get broadband into the home, or like the majority of Americans like had broadband into the home by like around 2005. Like a lot of these things that were previously really expensive, maybe it's like I'm also riding on top of like in terms of like the tech driver, just the diminished costs of digital storage, which also plays into like a video streaming service that has to host these large video files. Now all of a sudden that's cheap enough to to be able to use an ad supported business model. So yeah, these timing patterns I think help you think through some of those potential outcomes and then what you might do about it.
Well, and that's definitely true of the cloud and hosting, like you said, data storage, bandwidth, like businesses we couldn't have done 20 years ago because all that stuff would have been too expensive. All of a sudden now is like trivial. You know,
Yeah.
even today, video hosting and video streaming can be pretty expensive. Like if you're trying to host a lot of video and still
Hmm.
having to pay for all that, like some of that stuff can still be pretty expensive, but at least now it's potentially affordable. Where like 20, 25 years ago, like I don't know how you would have done this.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
it would have been absurd. Um, I love your the timing patterns. Is anything more of that, or do you have other frameworks?
So the other thing I do in this book, because I really want this to be very practical and actionable, so I explain, and I kind of got to this point by running workshops on this why now topic. And I did these workshops at various startup accelerators, at some other like corporates. I certainly did this in like the classes that I taught and some of my other colleagues' classes when I would visit. So one of the other frameworks that I bring people through is what I call a why now session, and it's basically like how you can take some of the things I've already mentioned. So looking for timing drivers or figuring out what an improved business model looks like all those things, and then I map them out. So, and it's not to say, hey, we're gonna predict the future, but when I say map them out in terms of time, like okay, we've got some previous similar companies that maybe failed. The situation's different now. What do I think is going to happen in the next couple of years? So it's not to say, hey, we can predict the future a couple of years from now, but in some situations, you can say, all right, if there's a cost curve or a performance curve that I expect is going to continue, I might say, today this is too expensive, but in a couple of years, I think this is actually going to be cheap. Therefore, I might want to start building this today.
Yeah.
As an example. So, yeah, I take people through that process, and then they can either say, "Hey, we're at that point already. Not many people have noticed this. I should do this," or "I think I should get my feet wet. in the next few years, this is gonna, I think the timing is gonna be right, and I should start learning about this and be ready. Um, so yeah, I try to keep it really, really actionable.
Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. Do you have any other final words of wisdom or tips to share with us today?
Um, you know, Stay optimistic. Certainly if you're out there building, it's tough, but yeah, stay optimistic. Get a good group of people around you who encourage you to do good work, and if you want to look for the ways that you might benefit from timing and asking that why now question, check out this book called Why Now: How Good Timing Makes Great Products. I hope you will enjoy it.
So you can find your book on Amazon.
Amazon, yeah.
Do you have any other resources out there or
If
that
you
people can learn from?
Yeah, if you look at my personal site, which is called startupsunplugged.com,
Okay.
I start when I was just starting to go through these ideas, I was blogging about it. So you'll find a bunch of blogs, a bunch of posts about related topics. Everything from how I started thinking about timing drivers to I did this whole thing looking at why now slides for companies that were pitching for investment and evaluating those and other things that are related to the topic. So yeah, you could certainly check out some of those posts.
All right. Well, this was Paul Orlando. Check out his book, Why Now? I'm sure we'll have a link in the show notes. And Paul, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks, Matt. It's a lot of fun.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning into Product Driven today. If you're passionate about building user-centric tech products, join over 30,000 tech leaders who receive the Product Driven newsletter directly in their inbox every week. Visit fullscaleteam.com/newsletter to sign up today for our newsletter. You can also view all of our episodes on YouTube and join over 50,000 others. And please follow me, Matt Watson, on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.